Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Introduction to Ethics. This video just kind of goes over your reading questions in response to J.S. Mill's Utilitarianism. We covered, back in the day, they would call it like book 2. We tend to call it chapter 2. I forget which one your translation uses. So let's just go with chapter 2. That's what we tend to call these things. Okay, so I'm going to switch to PowerPoint and I'm going to read a lecture that I wrote that accomplishes two things. First, it gives a lot of background information on Mill, and then it answers those reading questions that you've already completed and gives further explanatory detail. So this week's a little different. So what I would like you to do is get your own answers to those reading questions out in front of you. And as you go along through the video, kind of compare what you wrote with some of the things I say in this video, and just make sure you're tracking well and have a good understanding of the material. Instead of a detailed set of reading questions this week, I'm going to give you a discussion board instead. Instead of that being on new material, it's going to be on, well, the same material we covered last week. We're just going to take this second run at it, and the questions will have a little more depth than your average set of reading questions have had. The purpose won't be just to properly interpret the text. You'll be able to reflect a little deeper on some of the points made and apply his theory to some ethical conundrums. All right. So at this point, I'm just going to share my screen and read the lecture. All righty then. Oh, yeah. And just so you know, if you get bored listening to lectures, I've also put up the written version of the lecture, which you can probably get through a lot faster than listening to this. So if you're better at doing that, go ahead and go do that. You don't actually have to watch the video. All right, so here we go. And of course, I immediately start off with an ungrammatical slide. No, I don't. It's not what is utilitarianism. It's what utilitarianism is. I'm fine. All right, let's just keep going. All right. So let's start out with some background. Uh, John Stuart Mill was a British philosopher that lived during the 19th century, 1806 to 1873. He wrote influential works in virtually all areas of philosophy, including the philosophy of mathematics, the philosophy of science, and of course, ethics. Mill's ability was evident early on in his life. He was given a private and intensive education by his godfather, someone you probably haven't heard of, Jeremy Bentham. And he learned Greek starting at age 3 and Latin starting at age 8. He studied many of the major sciences of his day and was well read in the history of philosophy. The purpose of utilitarianism, I'm referring to that as the book title, is to give a definition of right and wrong in terms of what Mill calls the principle of utility, or what is commonly referred to as the greatest happiness principle. Sorry, I lost my spot in the lecture. Let me pick back up here. Okay. Utilitarianism is an excellent book to begin one's study of ethics. It's not the first one we've covered, but it's actually a pretty good choice because it captures a good amount of ethical common sense. All right. Reading question 1A, the principle of utility. No, reading question 1 as a whole, I should say. Okay. So your first reading question, part A, asks you to write out and explain what Mill called the greatest happiness principle. A synonymous name for this principle is the principle of utility. And we will just abbreviate that as PU for now, for principle of utility. So here's the book version of that principle. And just go ahead and read it. I don't really need to read what's on the slide. That can be a little tedious. So just take a second and read the definition. All right. So hopefully you've gotten through the definition on the screen. What I would like to do now is rephrase the principle of utility to make it more comprehensible without altering the meaning that Mill intended. So look at the first sentence of this definition that you now see on the screen. What does it mean to say actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness? The phrase in proportion is not as common as it used to be, so let us substitute for it the phrase to the degree that. With this substitution, the principle of utility now reads, actions are right to the degree that they tend to promote happiness. Actions are wrong to the degree that they tend to promote the reverse of happiness. And the rest, of course, is the same. By happiness is intended pleasure in the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. All we have done here is substitute one phrase in proportion for another to the degree that. You have probably noticed that the principle of utility defines what actions are right and which are wrong in terms of the amount of happiness and unhappiness that these actions cause. Mill then states very clearly that he is defining happiness and unhappiness in terms of pleasure and pain. Let us once again alter the wording of the principle of utility without altering the meaning. We will drop the concept happiness from the definition altogether because Mill has told us what he means by happiness. Consider the following shortened definition. Actions are right insofar as they tend to promote pleasure and the absence of pain, and wrong insofar as they tend to promote pain and prevent pleasure. This principle of utility, we'll just call it PU sub 2, means the exact same thing as PU sub 1, and it has the advantage of being more concise and also more specific. A very vague phrase, happiness, is replaced with something more specific, namely pleasure in the absence of pain. Now, the principle of utility sub 2, which is what you see on screen right now, is not as clear as it could be, so I'm going to add a couple of components to it that make what Mill had in mind even more explicit. One question you may have asked yourself is whose pleasure and pain is relevant to determining the rightness or wrongness of an action? The answer is everyone who is affected by that action. In other words, what Mill did not have in mind is that the person that commits the action only needs to think of their own pain and pleasure. Mill is clear throughout the book as a whole that one must judge an action by the consequences it has for everyone affected by that action. There is one more concept that I would like to introduce before I give the final modification of the principle of utility. That is the concept of a relevant alternative. A relevant alternative all right, so let me back up again. I lost my place in the reading. So we're going to talk about the concept of a relevant alternative. Suppose that you have a decision to make concerning whether you should cheat on the final. The relevant alternative is to not cheat on the final. You, of course, could choose to drop out of school altogether, but if this is an impractical alternative that you are really not considering, then that alternative isn't actually relevant. Hence, in practice, the principle of utility will be applied to a restricted range of alternatives that are what we call live options for you. Let us say simply that a relevant alternative is an alternative you could realistically choose. So, with the concept of a relevant alternative in mind, consider the following and modification of the principle of utility. We'll just call this PU sub 3. All right, so actions are right insofar as they intend to promote more overall pleasure and less overall pain for the group of persons that are affected by the action in comparison with the relevant alternatives to that action. Similarly, actions are wrong insofar as they tend to promote more overall pain and prevent more overall pleasure for the group of persons that are affected by the action in comparison with the relevant alternatives to that action. Now, the principle of utility sub 3, it does leave some questions unanswered, but it's suitable for our purposes. It has the advantage of being applicable to actual decisions. Consider again the choice to cheat on the final or not cheat. Let's say that you know the class is graded on a curve. The group of persons affected by your actions are therefore the class as a whole. You know that the rest of the members of the class will be dissatisfied if their grade is lower because you cheated and scored higher. Let us say that you also know that you will not be very proud of your accomplishment if you get a higher score through cheating. The relevant alternatives are to cheat and not cheat. And in this case, at least, given this set of facts, it is clear that cheating is wrong. The principle of utility sub 3 is a proposed explanation of why it is wrong. Cheating in this case is wrong because it does more harm and otherwise causes more pain and prevents more pleasure than it does good in comparison to the relevant alternative of not cheating. Okay, so just a quick note here. I suppose we have a lot to get through, so I'll make this quick. For the utilitarian, they're dead serious when they say the only thing that's really bad is pain. The only thing that's really good is pleasure. They, for example, wouldn't consider cheating intrinsically bad in and of itself. It all depends on the consequences that flow from any specific act of cheating. And most ethical theories are not like this. There's more principles built into them that kind of come in at the ground level, and certain actions are considered out of court, regardless of their consequences. What's unique about utilitarianism, and it doesn't really operate that way. All right, so let's proceed to question 1B. What two ends are the only ends that people desire on Mill's view? Consider the following quotation from Mill. His answer is basically pleasure in the absence of pain. According to Mill, that's all we ever really desire. So this might seem like a point you can push back on with Mill, but we'll discuss that in a little bit. Okay, so consider the following quotation from Mill, but these supplementary explanations do not affect the theory of life on which this theory of morality is grounded, namely that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and that all desirable things, which are as numerous in the utilitarian as in any other scheme, are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. So Mill is stating here his view that the only things that people desire and pursue are pleasures, or things that lead to pleasure, and the avoidance of pain. Mill thinks that he has correctly defined what is right and wrong in terms of the pain and pleasure that is caused by an action, because he thinks that the attainment of pleasure and the avoidance of pain is what people really value. Okay. Now, this isn't obviously true, and I'll give you a discussion board. One of your discussion board questions will be on this. Briefly, people often find activities meaningful in a way that is incredibly hard to cash out in terms of being pleasurable. People will often even give their lives for a cause at great cost to themselves because they believe in that cause, but it might be a stretch to say that they're pleased to pursue it. Um, be a very flexible use of the word pleased. So Mill's not obviously right about this, so just keep that in mind for the discussion board later. Okay, so let us explain a little further. Let us distinguish between right and wrong on the one hand and good and bad on the other. Uh, an action is right if it should be done, and wrong uh, if it should not be done. Mill actually has a little bit more to say about this. He says an action is wrong if other people can justifiably punish or criticize you for performing it. Maybe that would be a little better here. Um, but the key here is rightness and wrongness is not the exact same thing as good and bad. Something is good if it is valuable and worth having, and something is bad if it is harmful and not worth having. Okay, so here's an example of something that's bad but not wrong. You're walking through the woods one day, you get mauled by a bear. Well, the bear is not a moral agent, so nobody's done anything wrong. But what happened to you is kind of bad. It's harmful and certainly not worth having happen to you. Right and wrong introduce the element of, okay, the following action might be bad for someone, therefore, you should avoid doing it. So it's a term that incorporates a notion of accountability, not just a notion of disvalue. Okay, so remember Mill's principle of utility. He's defining an action as wrong, one you should not do, one you could be held accountable for doing, in terms of which is bad or perhaps not as good as it could have been. And he's not radically unique in this way, but not all theories do this. Not all theories of right and wrong start from the assumption that there's a deep connection between what is right and wrong on the one hand and what is good and bad on the other. Many philosophers think it is a strength of the utilitarian theory that there is such a deep connection between these two sets of concepts. It is plausible to suppose that we wrong others, in other words, do something wrong to them, by taking away from them or depriving them of something that is valuable, or by causing them harm, which is, of course, something bad. If all that people desire and value is pleasure and freedom from pain, which, of course, is Mill's view, then the only way we can wrong others is by depriving them of pleasure and causing them pain. Mill's theory of what constitutes right and wrong, basically the principle of utility, is a lot more plausible if he's right about what is truly valuable, good and bad for persons. If more things are of value or disvalue to persons than pleasure and pain, then it looks as if we can benefit others. Sorry, I lost my track of thread. Yeah, here we go. If more things are of value or disvalue to persons other than pleasure and pain, then it looks as if we can benefit and wrong others uh, by either providing or denying them these additional goods. Hence, Mill's theory of right and wrong would become incomplete. So just a quick example of this. So you might think, let's say you're a really bad decision maker. So you just constantly make really bad decisions that result in harm, and it's perfectly predictable that left to your own devices, that you'll continue to do this, right? You still might think the good of choosing is itself intrinsically good, even though for you, exercising that good, or our hypothetical person, doesn't tend to result in pleasure in the absence of pain, maybe very much the opposite, yet you can plausibly hold that the right to choose is intrinsically good. Um, and that's the sort of challenge Mill's theory often gets. There are more goods in the world than that which is pleasurable, and there's more pains in the world than that which is painful. And it's even fair to say that if a certain sort of pain is meaningful, uh, it kind of walks the line between being painful and pleasurable. Mill's moral psychology doesn't actually go into all these subtle distinctions, but modern utilitarians, they tend to be a little bit more careful here than Mill was. All right. Reading question 2. This is called the swine objection to Mill's theory of value. Historically, many philosophers have defended the view that pleasure is what is good and pain is what is bad. Remember, this is important for Mill's theory of right and wrong because he defines right and wrong solely in terms of promoting pleasure and relieving pain. One group of philosophers that defended this view was the ancient Epicureans. In fact, today the word Epicurean is synonymous for hedonist, or one that lives solely for pleasure. The connotation of the word hedonist is actually somewhat negative. A hedonist on contemporary usage is the kind of person that likes nothing but sex, drugs, rock and roll, and perhaps tasty food. Such persons are often considered shallow and their lives somewhat trivial. With this in mind, consider the following quotation. Now, this is, of course, from Mill's book. Now, such a theory of life excites in many minds, and among them, in some of the most estimable and feeling in purpose, inveterate dislike. To suppose that life has no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine worthy only of swine. This is the essence of the swine objection. A theory of right and wrong that is based on a theory of value that says that only pleasure is good strikes a lot of people as a shallow theory. Now, pigs, or swine, of course, spend their day rolling around in mud and in their own waste and eating large quantities of food, throwing the occasional nap, and you have the pleasurable life of a pig. The problem is that we as humans, the problem is that when humans live a life that is suited to a pig, we have a strong intuition they are wasting their life, even if they experience a lot of physical pleasure. When we think of pleasure, we tend to think of what Mill calls the sensate pleasures. The pleasures of food and drink and sex and drugs and rock and roll. Hence, this theory of goodness in terms of pleasure might initially strike you as a shallow theory. We are more likely to describe these Hold on a second. Okay. All right. I lost my space for a second. We do not commonly speak of education or friendship as pleasurable. We are more likely to describe these goods as meaningful or perhaps enriching. However, we do say that these goods are enjoyable, and I suppose that this is a close synonym for pleasurable. This brings us to the Epicurean response to the swine objection that Mill adopts. It's not his only response, but he thought they had a good one. Okay, so this is the answer to question 2C. Consider the Epicureans have always answered the swine objection that it is not they, but their accusers who represent human nature in a degrading light. Since the accusation supposes human beings to be capable of no pleasures except those which swine are capable. So basically, the Epicureans defined pleasure much more broadly than their accusers gave them credit for. And this leads to a distinction between what Mill calls the higher and the lower pleasures. And this is relevant to question 3 from your reading questions. So here's another passage from Mill's text. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. But there is no known Epicurean theory of life that does not assign to the pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings, and the imagination, and of the moral sentiments a much higher value of pleasures than those of mere sensation. The ancient okay, one second. In answering question 2, we noted that Mill and the Epicureans believe that the pleasures that a human can experience are more diversified and noble than the pleasures that a pig can experience. This passage provides a bit more detail. The ancient Epicureans did indeed define good and bad in terms of pleasure. However, this is just a historical quirk. They lived very chaste lives as they thought that the pursuit of physical pleasures, food, drink, and sex, caused a lot of pain and inconstancy in life in the form of addictions and losses of self-control. What the ancient Epicureans valued was what Mill calls the higher pleasures. Question 3A asks you which pleasures the Epicureans considered higher, and 3B asks you to think of examples of each. So on the slide, we kind of go through some. The higher pleasures are pleasures of the intellect. So that's the gaining of various sorts of knowledge, whether it be philosophical, scientific, or just anything interesting about reality. Pleasures of the emotive or feeling part of the soul. This would include things such as friendship and familial love. There's pleasures of the moral sense. Mill probably had in mind here something like our sense of what is noble and worthy of human dignity. He doesn't define it clearly in the text. Yeah, but this whole distinction between higher and lower pleasures uh, suggests he's thinking of that which is good and worthy of being human. That's a broadly moral uh, sense that discerns that. There's also pleasures of the aesthetic sense, appreciation of various forms of beauty. And there's also pleasures of the imagination. So this would be things like art and creativity. Obviously, that would overlap both the pleasures of the intellect and pleasures of the aesthetic sense. These are not sharply distinguishable. Question 3C asks if you agree or disagree that the lower bodily pleasures are inferior or less important in some way than the higher pleasures. This question is will become one of the discussion board questions that you'll answer. So I will not say too much here. I will, however, note that there is a difference between saying that the higher pleasures are more important than the lower pleasures and saying that they both need to be a part of a deeply satisfying life. Mill is clearly committed to the former of these claims, but again, he's not obviously right about that. And there's a very ancient tradition in philosophy of kind of downplaying the significance of the body in favor of the significance of the intellect and conscience. This goes back to Plato and Aristotle, probably even before them. It's contained in many of the world's mythologies and religions. The same kind of thought that the dignity of the human is more contained in the intellect and the imagination and the creative component. And the bodily part is just something we share with the other animals. So it's our lower self, our animal self. So that'll be fun to reflect on in the discussion board if you agree or disagree with that. Okay. Question number 4, an argument in favor of the mental or higher pleasures. Mill notes that the following argument is common in utilitarian literature in defense of the view that the mental pleasures are superior to the bodily pleasures. This is also a very ancient argument, and it could even be found I found it in Plato's dialogues in a couple places. So here we go. So it must be admitted, however, that the utilitarian writers in general have placed the superiority of mental over bodily pleasures chiefly in the greater permanency, safety, and uncostliness of the former. That is, in their circumstantial advantage rather than in their intrinsic nature. Okay, so here's a little more detail on the slide. It's good for a pleasure to be permanent, safe, and uncostly in order to avoid pain. So the utilitarians and Epicureans valued pleasures that were predictable and controllable. In other words, they valued safety. And according to this particular argument, the higher pleasures are not intrinsically better or more noble. They're just more permanent, they're more safe, and they're less costly. So their superiority is broadly quantitative. You're more likely to hold on to them for a long time, permanence. They're less likely to cause you pain, that's safety. Yeah, so these are more quantitative measures of why they're better. And they all, in regards to safety, they noted physical pleasures can be addicting and therefore highly disruptive. So this is something the ancients also talked about. Okay, now let's analyze that first argument. Are the mental pleasures really more permanent, safe, and uncostly than more bodily pleasures? It's not obviously the case. So take, for example, he puts friendship and familial love in the category of the higher pleasures. But the more friends you have, the more care about your family, you are actually more vulnerable to certain types of pain when the loss of friendship occurs or if the family breaks down. He thinks pleasures of knowledge are more permanent, but that assumes knowledge is always pleasurable. It's a well-known feature of human nature that will go to great lengths to avoid knowing the truth on various occasions when the truth is painful. So it's not clear that this argument even works at all, but Mill does kind of ratify it at some points. He thinks there's something to it, but he also thinks he has a better argument for the superiority of the higher pleasures over the lower pleasures. Okay. So question 5 has to do with the quality of a pleasure versus its quantity. So the argument that is presented in question 4 for the superiority of the higher pleasures did not attempt to argue that the higher pleasures were more intrinsically valuable. However, this is exactly what Mill's own position is. According to Mill, a human life that is devoid of the higher pleasures is a life he considers ignoble, trivial, and shallow. In contrast, a life of self-sacrifice to a noble cause that one cares about, even if devoid of the sensate or physical pleasures, is a fulfilling and worthy life, according to Mill. Mill himself was a social reformer. He fought for public education, the rights of the poor. He was the first major British philosopher to argue that women are equal to men. He also was really into defending the rights of animals. So experientially, he has what he takes to be evidence that the life of the higher pleasures, these more meaningful pursuits, they're just going to be intrinsically better than the lower pleasures. They provide meaning, or the lower pleasures do not. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Let's get some definitions. We could say the quantity of a pleasure is its intensity and its duration, whereas the quality of a pleasure has to do with its intrinsic value. Quantity is an easy concept, and I assume you get it. So let's move on to quality. The quality of a pleasure is its intrinsic value. You can compare, and I think I set up the question this way, the pleasure of playing a video game with the pleasure of investing in a good friendship. The latter pleasure we think of as more important and more worthy of pursuit. We are more likely to think that a person that indulges constantly in the pleasure of playing video games is wasting their life, whereas we would not think that a person that spends a lot of time investing in friendship is wasting theirs. That kind of gets us to what Mill has in mind. So by the intrinsic higher value or higher quality of a pleasure, its meaningfulness, its importance, its significance. Does it contribute to a life worth living, or is it more a trivial waste, even if it's pleasurable? So that's a good way to get at what he has in mind, and it's a pretty common thought. That's not remotely unique to Mill. We all, I think, make these kind of judgments and discriminations. Okay, now. Question 5a asks, what test does Mill propose for determining whether one pleasure is of a higher quality than another? So this is actually, most people think he's wrong about this, but it's in the text, so let's go with it. All right, so if I'm asked what I mean by difference of quality in pleasures, or what makes one pleasure more valuable than another, merely as a pleasure, except it's being greater in amount, there is but one possible answer. Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all, or almost all who have experience of both, give a decided preference, irrespective of any moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. And by desirable, he means the one that's of higher quality, more important, more significant, just plain better than the other type. Okay. So basically, according to Mill, when you want to figure out if one pleasure is of higher quality than another, you must gather the people that have experienced both and see which they prefer. if they overwhelmingly prefer one over another, and if they can kind of screen out that there's sense they have a duty to prefer one over the other, then that pleasure, the one that's overwhelmingly ratified as the better one, is of higher quality. Okay, so here's some commentary on that. Oh yeah, so this slide kind of captures the test. Let me just scroll through slowly. Okay. Now, it's easy to miss just how controversial a statement Mill is making. A lot of people think this is one of the worst arguments in this whole book. Uh, so here's an example. For example, if it turns out that all persons that appreciate the symphony and punk rock judge the symphony to be more pleasurable or a better pleasure, then this is a proof that the symphony is objectively superior than punk rock for everyone. So if you happen to prefer punk rock and think that punk rock is superior, you are simply wrong about that. Perhaps you lack good aesthetic judgment. I've used an example drawn from aesthetics, and in doing so, I may have made Mill's argument appear weak, um, but it's still a good point to make, right? So let's say most people prefer the symphony who have experienced both to punk rock, right? Or let's just say progressive metal or something like that. Um, Now you could argue the only thing that follows is that for the majority of people, that's the better pleasure. But those that actually prefer the alternative, for them, that's the better pleasure. And that seems like a perfectly reasonable stance to take. But Mill wants the majority view to somehow lock in an objective and universalizable answer to the question. Um, okay, now just so you can see that he's not obviously right about that. Now let's look at an example he uses that's actually a little stronger than the aesthetic one I used about musical taste. Okay, consider the following passage. Okay. Now, it is an unquestionable fact um, that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating, enjoying both um, do give a marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. Sorry for the pause there. It's actually, I thought it was ungrammatical for a second. So let me read that again. It's not. Now, it is unquestionable fact that those who are equally acquainted with and equally capable of appreciating and enjoying both do give a marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. Few human beings or creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of a beast's pleasure. So Mill is arguing here that even if a person knew they would experience more pleasure as a beast because they have a high quantity of beastly pleasures, say grazing on the prairie or running with the herd, or perhaps having really good gazelle sex, uh, that they wouldn't choose that. They just wouldn't give up the higher life of the mind, the intellect, the imagination, the various types of appreciation we're capable of for more bodily or sensate pleasure. Um, and Mill kind of reiterates this fact in another equally famous quote, actually a more famous quote. It's on the slide here. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus. No person of feeling and conscience would be selfish and base, even though they should be persuaded that the fool, the dunce, or the rascal is better satisfied with his lot than theirs. So the idea is, now this thought's independently plausible than his test for distinguishing higher and lower pleasures. So remember the context of the quote. He wants to argue that the higher pleasures of intellect, friendship, imagination, beauty, the moral sentiments, he just wants to argue they're better than bodily pleasures. And this is actually a pretty good argument in favor of that. Even if you knew you'd be happier as a fool, someone who lacks knowledge, um, you wouldn't consent to do that. Um, Even if you knew you'd be happier if you were a lot more selfish, you probably wouldn't let go the pleasures you take in seeing others do well, which is kind of at the heart of being unselfish, taking pleasure in other people's good fortune. You would just think less of yourself if you swapped out one set of pleasures for another, even if they had a higher quantity to them. So, this is Mill's argument that the higher pleasures are just better than the lower. Okay, now let me pause here. Let me reconnect. There's a lot of thoughts we've had in succession. So just get the big picture real quick. Mill's defining right and wrong as the action that is right is the one that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain. Um, okay, that seems kind of shallow. That's the swine objection. But Mill's saying, okay, human pleasures aren't like pig pleasures. We have sensate pleasure, bodily pleasure, but we also have intellectual, creative, and relational pleasures that are far above those. Um, and it seems like that's a plausible view to take, that not only are the higher pleasures different than the mere physical or bodily pleasures, but there is a sense in which we value them more. And this last quote here, I think, is Mill's strongest argument for that conclusion. Okay. Now, same theme, going a little deeper. All right. Mill then goes on to give the following quotation. It is indisputable that the being whose capacities of enjoyment are low has the greatest chance of having them fully satisfied. And a highly endowed being will always feel that any happiness which he can look for as the world is constituted is imperfect. But he can learn to bear its imperfections if they are at all bearable, and they will not make him envy the being who is indeed unconscious of the imperfections, but only because he feels not at all the good which those imperfections qualify. And this is the famous part. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So Socrates, he was an ancient Greek philosopher that pursued wisdom and was put to death for his troubles. Many have found this quotation of Mill to be quite profound, and the last two lines are often quoted. Um, Actually, they're often misquoted. The common phrasing is, it is better to be Socrates satisfied than a pig dissatisfied. People tend to truncate the quote, but that's not quite right. In any case, what Mill is claiming here is that those whose lives are more aware, are more susceptible to not being completely fulfilled than less aware persons are. So Mill's pointing out, yeah, the more you value things and hence take various dimensions of reality seriously, especially in the social sphere with other human beings, you're actually very susceptible to noticing imperfections in people and things and relationships, yourself, and that could be very painful. Yet, Mill argues, you wouldn't give that up to be in a kind of like this foolish ignorance state where you're not aware of all the world's imperfections. So more aware or cultivated persons, even though they're susceptible to more forms of pain that less aware or simpler people are not, you would still prefer to retain that complexity. And Mill sees this as kind of contributing to his claim that the higher pleasures, and therefore pains too, are more significant than the merely bodily dimensions of being. Um, Now, um, so let's say you cultivate your intellectual and moral sense. That's history shows, experience shows. That's likely to be accompanied by a lot of suffering. But Mill thinks the fact that so many people choose to kind of go forward with that, cultivating those sentiments, those abilities, those forms of awareness. He thinks it just shows that the higher pleasures of intellect, um, social pleasures, the aesthetic pleasures, they're so important, we won't even let those go, even if they're attended by pain. Um, okay. So as you can see, Mill's chapter 2 in his major work, Utilitarianism, there is a thread of thought here, but he often pauses to make some subpoints and digressions. So if you, again, the main thought, right and wrong are definable in terms of pleasure and pain. And by pleasure and by pain, he means both higher and lower pleasures and pains. That's why it's not a shallow theory of value, and therefore not a shallow theory of right and wrong. Okay, so I'm going to end this here. I'm going to set up your discussion board. You're going to have to answer 4 or 5 questions. Let's say 4 questions. I'll set it up with 4 questions, and they'll each involve a paragraph length response. And it'll count for a lot more than the average discussion board because this is your major assignment this week. All right, good times. Hope you learned a lot, had opportunity for reflection, and I look forward to reading your posts.